Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I am your host, Joanna. Let's get started.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the show. Recent data in surveys done by Origin and Mission Australia shows that 60% of young people aged 15 to 19 in Australia experience social exclusion in a 12-month period. Social exclusion can actually impact on employment and housing later on, and those who are excluded may have more medical needs and yet less access to health services. So, joining us today is David Oberleitner, Professor of Psychology and Director of the Division of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Bridgeport. He teaches a variety of courses in psychology, serves as a faculty advisor to numerous psychology majors, and frequently teaches for the honours program. His research interests fall broadly in social psychology, with specific research interests in the social cognitive processes underlying social exclusion, stigma, and the interplay of social exclusion and social processes regarding health and substance use. He also has research interests in teaching methodologies and individual differences related to teaching and student success. David received his PhD and MA in psychology from Wayne State University, and we are very excited to have him join us on the show today to learn from his expertise. So, welcome to the show, David.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Of course, it is great to have you here, and I'd love to get to know a bit about your background. So, can you tell us firstly a bit about what compelled you to pursue psychology?
Yeah, so I mean, when I was in high school, elementary school, I really always wanted to be a teacher. And when I went to university, I went to college for undergraduate studies. I started as a music education major, actually. And, because of that, we had a liberal arts curriculum where I took a psychology class to fulfill one of my social science requirements. And it really was the first time that something just clicked so much for me. I felt like it was one of the first times I didn't have to really even think about it. It made sense. It felt intuitive, and I was just drawn to it. And really from that point on, I switched my major. I went back to a music minor and, pursued psychology and psych research pretty much from there on out. And really kind of fell in love with social psych from that, that first class experience I had in social psych.
Wow, that's really interesting, especially to me. I also did music at university, not education,
Nice.
but that's really cool.
Nice.
I love it. I love hearing about how people's journeys change. It's always really fascinating.
I agree.
Can you also tell us, just to introduce a little bit about our topic, what are some of the common misconceptions about social exclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the real big misconceptions, I think, is that for a lot of people, they feel like exclusion is something that they can either ignore or that they should just be able to talk themselves through. And I think that that's really one of the reasons I got excited about social exclusion as a research area and as an interest area was that pretty universally, the research supports that any hint of exclusion, you are bothered by it, and there are very immediate, physical, psychological impacts that happen from that experience, and even when it is beneficial sometimes to be left out, research studies have found that people still are bothered by it, even when there's very overt benefits to it or compensations for being left out. And to me, I think that's one of those big things in psych, but big things with social exclusion, especially is, we hear it with depression, you're surrounded by people that are you're happy. You have so many good things. Why can't you be happy? And the same thing I think is really true with exclusion. You're, going to be impacted by it. And it's a very universally common thing to have an experience of.
Yeah, very interesting. So before we dive further into our topic today, we wanted to get to know you a little bit better. So this is Have You Met David? First of all, what do you like to do in your spare time?
So spare time, one of the biggest is spending time with my family. My wife. I have three kids. So a lot of family activities. When I'm not doing work, psychology, family things. I really big into music. I still enjoy playing the drums. I'm really enjoy backpacking and camping. So getting
Wow.
out and trying to be in nature as much as I can.
Yeah, great. That's a lot of varied interests there. I love it. Do you also enjoy books and movies? Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, no, I probably watch more like long form serial, kind of Netflix Stranger Things, that would be something
Yeah.
kind of I watch more than movies sometimes. But books I definitely read. Like I was just rereading A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson, for example. One of the ones kind of, again, because I like to be outside and in nature and don't get a chance to do that as often as I'd like. So, was just recently rereading that again, for hiking the Appalachian Trail, and hearing about someone that was experiencing that.
Wow. Yeah. Fascinating. And are you listening to any podcasts at the moment?
Admittedly, there's not a ton that I subscribe to.
Yeah,
With
fair.
podcasts, I tend to be a little more scattershot. So if I have something that I read about on Wikipedia and I want to do a deeper dive, I'll search out like a history podcast, science podcasts, but I tend to be a little more, not any one thing that I tend to listen to or subscribe to.
Yeah, that's fine. Just looking for things that maybe align with your interests every now and then.
Yep, yeah.
Yeah.
Usually I don't listen to too much that's professional. I try to listen to stuff that's outside of psych, admittedly, just a
Yeah.
little more fun.
No, I agree. I tend to listen to more like comedy kind of podcasts myself. So that makes sense.
Nice. Yeah.
My next question for you is, do you have a role model? It could be either personally or in your professional life.
I don't think I have a specific role model. I mean, really, I think more the people that I look up to the most are the people that are really passionate about what they're doing, the people that are, in my life that are willing to kind of go outside of the maybe what they feel is easy to try to make the world a little bit of a better place, and I look up to those people that are willing to kind of deep dive on whatever they're exploring, and really, try to live as deep a life as you can, but not
Yeah.
any one specific person, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, is there a course or a class that has inspired you? It could be one you've taken or even that you've taught.
Yeah, I mean, I think my two favorite undergraduate classes, there was a cognition class and an intro to astronomy class, and
Wow.
both of them, I loved them because the professor was just so engaging, and that really it was one of the things that really inspired me to want to be a professor, was that I could see how passionate they were about getting people excited about their topics, and even when it was something that was a little maybe more dull, they had prepared to really get the room energized about that topic. You could never tell when they didn't like something, and that really, I think, tried to make me, it affected how I try to approach everything that I'm doing. That even if something's a little dull in the classroom or in life, find the fun with it and make sure I'm staying excited about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I've had some fantastic professors as well throughout my education, and they really, sometimes they can make or break a subject. It's like you just got to get excited about something so that you can even push through the difficult content. Yeah, I totally agree. So let's dive into some of our more um, technical questions for the podcast, and we'll start with some definitions so that we just get the basics down. For starters, how would you define personal resilience?
So for me, I think personal resilience is really, I mean, I think it's a broad concept for me that would include any way that somebody is able to kind of work through a challenging time. And for me with personal resilience, I struggle that there's any one right way to define how someone should be or could be resilient. In psychology, we talk about things like social networks, social support, as a way that the people that are around us can help us, be buffered from stress, or avoid, some of the negatives of being in stressful situations. We talk about in psychology things like coping strategies. How do you actively progress through a problem that you're having? To me, I think all of those things encompass that idea of resilience, that for any one person, there's not necessarily always a right or wrong way of how they should be getting through a tough situation. It's more what capacity and skills have you acquired to be able to get through that tougher situation.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And then how would you define social exclusion?
So for me, I would leave it pretty simple. I would say it's just the experience of being ignored or being left out. And
Hmm.
I'll highlight that idea of experience, that there's a lot of ambiguity sometimes in social situations. And one thing we know with social exclusion is that even if it is not a deliberate exclusion, if you feel it's an exclusion, it's still an exclusion. You're still impacted as if it had happened, you know, whether it's deliberate or not, but really just that feeling and that experience of being left out.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And what would you say are some common ways that people might experience social exclusion in their day to day lives?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think it's one of the things, like I think I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I found most fascinating when I was originally starting to explore social exclusion was it's such a common experience. I think everyone's had that experience of being in like a classroom in middle school or high school where you raise your hand and the teacher doesn't call on you, and it's like, oh, did they think I wasn't going to get the right answer? Did they not see me? We give all ourselves all of these reasons in our head likely of why someone left us out or excluded us. Like if you get picked last in gym class, why did that happen? Do they think I'm not good at that sport? And that's that commonality of exclusion, I think, is what makes it so powerful. So I think any of those could be good examples. Being passed up for a promotion, not having someone that you're wanting to date connect with you or text you back. Any of those things could be labeled under that umbrella of exclusion.
Mm. It seems like a lot of the things you said there, would you say that there's sort of an element of the unknown that comes into play? Because a lot of those things you said were like something would happen and then you start questioning, why was I not chosen or why was I ignored? Does that also impact on people?
I think so. I mean, I think it's in some ways that ambiguity of the social situation, I feel like, is what makes exclusion sometimes powerful in the negative sense. Is we have to come up with that attribution, that explanation of why that experience happened. And there's no guarantee that we're right or wrong with it. We may never know why someone was acting in a certain way. Did they deliberately not want me, or did they just happen to miss me and it's completely random? But at the end of the day, the experience is what counts, because regardless of why it happened, if you feel like you were left out, that's still impactful to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So then how would you describe the relationship between personal resilience and social exclusion?
So I think that they're very highly connected because, again, I think with exclusion, a lot of the research shows we have very immediate responses to it. We have very immediate reactions to it. But when we're talking about resiliency, there's a lot of ways that we can have a kind of maybe a better well of support within ourselves, that may help us offset that. Someone, for example, who is experiencing exclusion and they have had a lot of other negative experiences going on in that moment, that might impact them quite a bit more. Or if it happens that they're excluded or they feel they're excluded very frequently, that may give them less and less resilience to be able to kind of work through when it would happen the next time.
Mm, absolutely. And so, kind of jumping off of that, I suppose, what are the psychological effects of facing social rejection or exclusion?
So we see a few. Some of the literature out of social psych finds that psychologically, for example, when someone is excluded, we see a reduction in their self-esteem. We see increased negative moods. We see feelings that they have less control or a lack of control. When they self-report on scales like how much control you do feel you have in your life, they will consistently report lower. They will also talk about feelings that life has slightly less meaning, even immediately after experiencing an exclusion event. We would say psychologically too, in the long term, things like depression can happen. There is physiological changes too. When an individual is experiencing exclusion, there's research that finds, for example, pain pathways light up very similarly to if someone was experiencing physical pain. The region of the brain that some of the research has found activates is the anterior cingulate cortex, which we see activate when you are experiencing physical pain. We see things like cardiovascular risk, increased chance of stroke, increased chance of depressive symptomologies. all of this can happen. And again, it might not happen every time. I don't think any of the research would say like you didn't get picked on in class, so you're going to have this immediate, but it's that cumulative effect. It's that chronic kind of reaction that we can have if we're experiencing it again and again and again. The psychological measures we do see can happen pretty quickly, though, even if they're relatively temporary, if it's like a one-time event.
Yeah, that makes sense too. And so you mentioned there those pain pathways. One of my questions for you is actually about the concept of social pain, and that research often links social exclusion to this concept of social pain. Can you tell us a bit about what this means and in what ways, as you were saying, is it similar or different to physical pain?
Yeah, so I mean, when we look at like studies on brain activation, as I mentioned, that anterior cingulate cortex, we do see activates very similarly when someone is experiencing social pain, just like if they are experiencing physical pain. We've seen research fairly recently, even that something like acetaminophen, paracetamol, that common painkiller can actually reduce experiences of social pain. There's been studies, for example, that found that when people were given like placebo or acetaminophen, they reported less experiences of exclusion in their day-to-day life when they were having that. It's masking pain very similarly because it is a very similar, pain system. I think a lot of social psychologists would argue that that's probably fairly evolutionarily connected. There's two researchers that did a review paper, Baumeister and Leary, that was on the idea of the need to belong. So they had this concept that humans have an evolutionary need to belong. That it was very beneficial to our early ancestors to have social groupings. And that if you were outcast, that had extreme responses, in what your day-to-day life may be. If you're coming from like a hunter-gatherer society and all of a sudden you're kicked out of that group, life is much more immediately dangerous and hard for you. So having a pain system like that, physical pain is there to warn us and give us that alert that something is wrong, in our body, that we need to attend to something, or do something about or protect ourselves somehow. And I
Mm,
think, the social pain system, people argue, is very, very similar. It's set up so that we are aware and we notice when there is hints of social exclusion. It may not be beneficial to us now, but it was at a time very beneficial to be very kind of hyper attuned and hyper aware of, the possibilities of when exclusion might be occurring.
yeah, that's so interesting. I love hearing about when things come from evolution. It always just gives you a bit of an explanation as to, oh, that's how my brain works because of, all those thousands of years ago. It's fantastic. Are there also any specific neural or hormonal responses that come into play?
Yeah, when we look at some of the research on social exclusion, we see, for example, like hormonal cortisol, a common hormone that we see activates when we have a stress response, becomes very, very elevated. There's research, for example, when they would block certain types of dopamine receptors, people in that moment would start to actually feel more lonely, because we know that those systems are connected. When we would see some of those other connections, I mean, like pain pathways, we've talked about a little bit very similarly. Serotonin, there's a little bit of research that can be reduced if you've been experiencing social exclusion. So, quite a few ways that I think those physical and, psychological systems are connected.
Yeah, absolutely. So, recent studies have also shown that social exclusion can be as harmful to physical health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Would you say that this is accurate in any cases? And if yes, why?
So I would say accurate with maybe a couple caveats.
Yeah,
I
sure.
think, the real critical issue with that, I think, is the, you know, how chronic that experience actually is. If you're, again, like, I'll use the example of like if you're in class and you raise your hand and you're left out, it's not necessarily going to be like you just smoked 15 cigarettes.
Mm,
But we know that the cumulative effect is there. Just like someone may be able to have a cigarette, once or twice a week, and they may not have very permanent or long lasting impacts. The same thing would be true, I would argue, with social exclusion. You can have that occasional, and we all have that occasional experience of being left out or ignored or feeling left out or ignored. But
Mm.
it's that long-term impact that is there. Just like if someone was smoking every day for years and years, the chances of lung cancer, heart attack, keep going up and up and up. The same thing I think would be true. The longer we experience, exclusion, or the more frequently, or the more long term our feelings of loneliness are, the more likelihood is that, we may have that be something that's going to impact us down the road and cause things like a cardiovascular problems, or, having that cortisol response become a more of a problem where it's impacting our overall physical health.
Interesting. So the longer it goes on for, the longer that those hormones can be, you know, elevated, which then further causes more issues.
Well,
Mm.
I think so. And I think, even when we look at it, that long term, we start to even change a little bit, I think, of how we self identify with ourselves. If you're someone who, for example, just once or twice is left out or ignored, it's easy to say, like, oh, that person didn't like me, or oh, they don't see who I am. I think there's more easy ways that we can kind of ignore that. We might, again, have that kind of momentary negative feeling that the research says is kind of always there, but it's not going to maybe change who or how we view ourselves. That chronic experience, we know can lead to things like changes in identity. How do we feel after being continually left out? Do we feel more
Mm.
like a loner or somebody who is outside of the mainstream? And that can be challenging for many. I think, in that it's that long-term change that really creates that negative impact over the, again, over the longer cumulative term.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess kind of going off that self-identifying, that changing and flowing, in what ways does repeated exclusion or rejection contribute to issues like depression, anxiety, loneliness, more serious mental issues? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely see connections with it in the research. We do see that, when someone has longer experiences of loneliness, the longer and the more intense they report that loneliness to be, the more that we do see like depressive symptomology start to appear. I think with many things in psychology, there's not going to necessarily always be that one critical moment of like, oop, you crossed that threshold and now you're depressed. It's again this kind of cumulative whole picture approach
Mm.
that the field takes with how we explain this. But if somebody is over and over again feeling like they can't make that social connection, or they're actively being left out, I'll use the word stigma. They may start to feel like, why am I being stigmatized? Is it because of how I look? Is it because of my identity? When we start to get into depression and loneliness, it's easy to get into this cycle of, I'm having a negative experience that makes me want to disconnect more because I'm nervous of having maybe another negative experience. That makes me feel more lonely, makes me less likely to want to go out and make those social connections. You start to get this cyclical, experience. And then that, I think, is the kind of the negative, power of exclusion, is that the longer and the more it happens, the more risk we have for things like loneliness, the more risk we have that depression would be a consequence of that.
Interesting. And so, in this case, what protective factors can help to mitigate this in socially isolated individuals? I mean, one of my links here says that studies have even linked social exclusion to an increased risk of suicidal ideation, which would make sense if they are becoming, depressive symptomology, like you were saying. So, yeah, what can we do to mitigate this in socially isolated individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways really is just really informing people about how to practice good mental health care, and destigmatizing mental health care in general. One of the barriers that I think I've encountered when I've explored social exclusion is that for many people they don't feel like it's a serious factor. If you're seeing someone that's depressed or they're saying they have suicidal ideation, we obviously very quickly take it seriously. But for individuals that are saying they're lonely, it doesn't have that same, at least for many, I don't think it has that same immediate, negative, I have to do something for this person, or I should seek out help because I'm feeling this. Many people, I think, are more willing to, feel lonely silently, because they may be unaware of the, consequences or long-term risks of that kind of feeling. But they don't necessarily feel that it's a strong enough thing that they need to seek out help. But having good mental health practices, like having a therapist on hand that you could talk to, being okay with talking about where you're feeling, I think the other thing is just generally having more social contacts. Being able to have other ways that you can reestablish yourself is going to help avoid some of that long-term chronic, feelings of loneliness or exclusion. Knowing that there's certain groups that you can seek out, individuals that you could go to a little bit more. Like if, for example, there's ways that we can do specific outreach for individuals, maybe if they're more like elderly or have mobility issues, they may not be able to get out of the house, but helping them connect to others in ways that are, we're deliberately helping them make some of those social connections, is going to help mitigate some more of those long-term effects. I would say even too, just things like getting good sleep, being able to have, with resiliency, more reserves to do, you know, to be able to have those reserves to really be able to work through those challenging situations, is going to give them the resiliency to work, to be willing to maybe re-engage socially or give social encounters more of a chance if they have had some experiences of exclusion or feelings of maybe being outside.
Mm. So really, keeping on top of your mental health can improve your resilience overall because like you say, like they say, like you can't pour from an empty cup, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
That makes sense. So, the survey I mentioned in my preamble found that young people who identified as gender diverse, Indigenous, living in lower socioeconomic areas, regional or remote areas, or who reported speaking a language other than English were experiencing social exclusion more often. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not surprised by that.
Mm,
It's easy, I think, when individuals are outside maybe the majority of the culture, especially in certain instances if they don't have, a large population of people like them. Like, if you're a non-native individual or you're someone who's learning the language of the country that you're living in, like the university I'm at, we have a lot of first generation students who are from other countries, and in some ways, they may feel a little bit alone, but having so many others around them that are also kind of experiencing that gives them that sense of community, even if it's not exactly their community.
mm,
When we look at, for example, like you mentioned, rural, individuals, if you are in an area where there's not many opportunities for social connection, you're inherently, I think, more at risk that you're going to have you know greater chances of feeling like you don't fit in or you don't have those social connections, just simply because of the function of not having enough people around you necessarily that you can or want to connect with. So I
mm,
think, when we're looking at like, individuals like gender diverse, Indigenous, non-native, or speaker English speakers, or whatever the case may be, those individuals I think are the ones that we need to be the most deliberate with, trying to make sure that we can help them find those connections, give them ways and give them, supports to help, integrate a little bit more and find people that they can have those connections with.
Interesting. I've just thought of a question that might be a little
Yeah.
strange, but do you find that loneliness impacts different people differently? Like, for example, I'm a very extroverted individual. So if I didn't have as much connection with others, I'd probably feel worse about myself, but maybe introverts wouldn't. Or do you think that there's, a certain level of connection everyone needs to be able to get along and have a stable mental health, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know that I've seen a ton in the research on exactly that, but I would say from what I've seen and what I've experienced, I would argue that probably those that are a little more introverted, they may not seek out social interactions as often. But I think that's what's powerful about, social exclusion and kind of loneliness research, is even if you're someone who generally maybe would not seek out those kind of interactions, they don't need a lot of social stuff to make them feel good, they're still going to be impacted in those moments that they do. So
Mm,
someone who's more extroverted, I would hypothesize probably maybe would be, wouldn't say more at risk, but they may have less up, they may have more opportunities to kind of, fill their bucket with social interactions. So if there is one or two exclusionary events, it may be a little less, less impactful. Whereas individuals that are a little more introverted, they may not seek out those things, but again, when they want it, they're still going to have that negative experience of missing out on it. Someone might be like, they want to be a hermit alone in the woods, 99 days out of the, out of 100. But if that one day they're going in and people still leave them out, they're still going to have that same consequence, I would argue. And again, I think that's one of the
mm,
things that really fascinates me about exclusion is, even if you don't generally care, if you're looking for it in that moment and it happens, it still bothers you.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's
exactly.
not a lot of research that's found a way to, when we've looked at things like personality, there's no one personality type that seems to not care about it. Again, kind of like even when there's benefits to being excluded, there was a research study where they paid people to, play like a virtual ball tossing game. It was called Cyberball. And in that game, when people would, one of the conditions is they would have individuals be, intentionally left out by computer controlled players. But every time that they caught the ball, they were given less amount of money from a pool. So it's like you could start off with $10. Every time you get the ball, you've got to give the team a quarter.
Mm.
So not getting the ball, you had more money at the end. People still didn't like to be excluded. There was still really no way to mitigate that feeling of, being left out is bothersome. Being left out can hurt.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that experiment with the game. That's very cool. Um, Speaking of that, actually, in today's digital age, how do you think social media has changed the way people experience social exclusion?
Yeah, I think it's really a double-edged sword. There is a lot of research that shows, I mean, enormous benefits for people in online communities. For example, someone that is grieving the loss of a spouse, like bereavement, cancer support groups, other kind of things like health issues. Online social media, the ability to interact with individuals over the internet, gives people a wealth of opportunities that they can reestablish connections that they might not have been able to originally. Again, your previous question on kind of like non-English speakers, in an English speaking community, gender diverse individuals, online interactions gives people the chance to have those connections in that community that they really wouldn't have had the ability to have before that. With that, though, I think there is also a lot of potential at times for problems. Cyberbullying, we know, can be a huge impact, on individuals. We know it can feel very pervasive. And, people feel a sense that once it's up on the internet, it's hard to get rid of it. It's there, and they're going to feel, if they were left out or something publicly bad happens on the internet, they worry about that. So, it's really one of those, I think, a lot of risk, but a lot of benefit, potential as well.
Wow. Yeah, that totally makes sense as well. And do you think, I mean, this is kind of related, but are there generational differences in how people cope with exclusion? So, for example, younger versus older individuals, how do they react differently?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there is a lot of research on when I've looked, I haven't seen a lot of research exploring generational differences, like in the experience of exclusion or coping with exclusion. But I think I will connect it a little more with the online question you had asked. That
Mm.
as we see, younger generations having more, I think, comfort with online, more ability to go and kind of seek out those kind of groups. There is, I think, a little more opportunity that they can find and connect with, like-minded people or people that are going through similar experiences and kind of develop that community and that network a little bit more. If I was thinking about, different generations, people that maybe weren't immediately raised to think to go onto the internet and look for something, maybe a little less inclined to maybe be aware that even those kind of groups can be out there, or that there are ways that you can connect more positively socially if they just generally have less experience with that or less day-to-day interactions that are, fully online.
And it's very validating too to see somebody having the same experience as you. And it really, like in my experience, combats loneliness if I see somebody, even if it's just like a little meme talking about like some experience that they've had, and I go, "That happened to me." I just feel like oh, it's not just me, and like I saw that happen, or yeah, it's really nice to
Yeah,
have that
absolutely.
connection. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm. So, finally, for this more technical section, is there anything that we don't know yet about social exclusion? What questions remain unanswered?
That's a great question. I mean, I think
Mm.
for me, a lot of it really is, I think, how do we best treat social exclusion? We know there's a lot of ways that we can like combat loneliness, again, by things like helping someone find a positive social connection, online communities, being deliberate with giving people coping strategies to help them be more resilient to work through negative feelings and negative emotions, general mental health care. But do we have like a one size fits all, like the DSM for clinical psychology? Do we have like a prescribed way that this is what we should always do, like as a therapy style for someone who's experienced exclusion? We don't necessarily have that yet as a field. We know that these things are there. There's a lot of work trying to look at that, but we don't necessarily have that yet. The same thing, I think a big unanswered for me kind of question is really, what makes someone more or less at risk for it? We have hints of things that we might be able to see would make someone more resilient, but there's not necessarily like a one size fits all personality that we know, like that person is safe from it, or this person is much more likely to have continued feelings of loneliness. We can measure their loneliness, but we don't necessarily have a great diagnostic tool to know who is most at risk for that, 5 years down the line, the way we can with some other types of, mental health, things. And I think the other one really is, just when does it, kind of going back to your question on like cigarettes, when does it cross that line of being truly like a harmful experience, a more chronically negative thing that's impacting us physically? Is it 10 times that you're excluded in a day? Is it a month of, chronic? We don't have a great timeline of how and why these things may, impact us. We just have a kind of general ballpark that more is worse. We know that chronic exclusion is worse, but being able to pinpoint, why for this individual or how much can this individual kind of work through, that's still where some of the big question marks, I think, would lie.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. I love that. I love that there's still unanswered questions and things we want to know to be able to treat it better. It's always fascinating to see and more research to be done.
Definitely.
So, moving on now to our practices and habits section. My question for you is, what are some habits that you'd recommend people practicing to cultivate resilience in the face of social rejection or exclusion?
Yeah, yeah, there's a few ways, I think. Again, there's maybe not a one size fits all approach that's going to be perfect for every person. But I think, a few strategies I would recommend. One is really just really prioritizing a base level of well-being. It's easy to want to prioritize things like, job fulfillment, pushing forward on certain tasks. But really, kind of as you said earlier, if our cups are empty, we don't have those reserves that we're going to be able to work through those more challenging situations. So really, even when it's hard, like even if there's a deadline that you have, being very, very mindful of like proper sleep, proper exercise, proper diet, having people in place, that you can turn to when you're going through a hard time, to be able to know that you're able to, have them when you need them, kind of doing like the maintenance work on mental health, before there's something that you actually have that, maybe even needs that level of resilience, the
Yeah.
pre-work. I think another one really is just being very deliberate with the kind of social interactions that we have, with exclusion. One thing I think I mentioned is a lot of it is the experience that an individual has of if they are being excluded. So really kind of going through and not treating social interactions and day-to-day interactions as just like a fluffy thing or a toss away idea, really going through and being deliberate of like checking in on the people around you, making sure that they know they felt seen, like family members, just how was your day? How are you doing? But being very mindful of, you're benefiting from having those social interactions the same way they're going to benefit from having those social interactions. I think another thing is, again, the experience of social exclusion is really, an individual experience. There's not always a right or wrong. Like, why did the teacher again not call on me? Well, maybe you're right with why they didn't. Maybe you're wrong. But if you're experiencing it, you're experiencing it. But that does give you a little bit of maybe ability to talk to yourself, of like, it's probably not something about me. It's, something about the situation, or, but giving yourselves those little internal kind of reminders. I don't think it's going to necessarily always fully eliminate. I would be remiss in saying that, because I don't think the research would support that there's a way to fully just, mitigate that experience, but giving yourself those kind of attributional outs, like it's not me, it's them, or it's about the situation. It was busy, it was noisy. helps take away maybe that sting a little bit or make it a little less, it's not me, it's the situation, and the more that we can do that, the more self-protective it is for us, and that's true of, I think, a lot of things, mental health, psychology related. The more that we can make that attribution, even if it's wrong, to put it onto something else, it's still self-protective for us. And I think really the last thing just would be really trying to make sure that, you're thinking about times that you're included. For someone that's really lonely, again, I don't know if I've seen like a research study that's supported this yet, but, doing things like just reminding yourself of those social interactions that you are having, giving yourself the chance to say, like, if you catch yourself feeling like you haven't had a positive interaction that day, or everyone's left you out, everyone's ignored you, you're like, well, no, when I went to get coffee, that person was really friendly. That was a positive interaction that I had, but giving yourselves those reminders. And again, if you're doing it as a maybe all of the time, thing for yourself, it's not just going to be something you can do when you have these negative moments. Making it part of your daily practice is going to help you, be able to overcome those things when they happen, because it's part of your daily routine at that point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So kind of being grateful for and appreciating more the positive interactions that you do have.
Yeah, and really just trying to emphasize and focus on them. I mean,
Yeah.
again, I don't think it's going to fully fix things, but again, if we're looking at how do we make ourselves more resilient, just being able to remind ourselves of the positives, it is a deliberate action that we can take that we do see can have benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. And of those suggestions that you've made, do you find that people have any particular challenges when they try and achieve that?
Probably with all of them. I mean,
Yeah.
I think, psychology is hard, and that we know that even if something is like a best practice, it doesn't mean that it's always going to be easy for the person to maintain. I think all of those steps are relatively easy steps that one could take. But admittedly, like, is it easy at the end of the day to not want to sit and think through positive interactions you've had? Sure. It feels a little silly probably at times,
Mm.
to make that part of your day to day, everyday thing. It's easy to ignore, personal health. It's easy to ignore, not getting enough sleep, even though we know pretty clearly, you're going to be more anxious next day if you don't get enough sleep. You're going to not feel emotionally happy if you don't get enough rest and exercise. It's easy to push those things off to try to, reach a certain goal or do a certain thing. So I think it's very easy to say these are things that can be beneficial, but, even if they're individually easy, it takes a real mindfulness, I think, to embrace it and want to do it every single day.
Yeah. So do you think you really have to be quite deliberate and disciplined about it and sort of in the same way as people, do mindfulness at the same time every day? Would you recommend something like that?
I mean, absolutely, I think so. I think
Mm.
mindfulness is a great example for that. The more that we can really, mindfully think about our social interactions and connections we have, likely the better that's going to be for us.
Yeah, great. Amazing. Well, we're going to move on now to our open mic section. So, this is your chance to talk about anything you're passionate about. It doesn't have to be related to our discussion so far, but it can be anything you want to tell to our audience or promote to our audience. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you. No, I think, for me, I think the biggest thing that I would really just add is with anything with social exclusion, it's really, if I was going to go on a soapbox, it's to just be really mindful of the interactions we have with people around us. If we know there is a level of ambiguity that's present that may make people feel like they're not being seen or not being heard, I think it's important that we really try to emphasize what we can do as an individual to make people feel a little more seen, a little more heard. Like, an example, when I'm teaching a class, I always try to, call on anybody, rotate in the class who I'm calling on. But I really try to be mindful of, like, at the end of the day, if someone didn't get called on, while they're packing up, like, hey, I'm so sorry I couldn't get to your question. Do you want to talk about this right now? Is it something you want
Mm,
to email? Just, it doesn't take a lot to be mindful that you can interact with somebody and give them that moment of, like, positivity or that, moment of connection. Those little minor moments, I think, can be just as powerful as some of the bigger, moments that we have. It doesn't always have to be a hugely deeply, you know uh, deep connection or even a deep interaction, but we can help someone be able to feel a little more connected to the world around us just through a smile, just through being able to, wave and, just acknowledge that they're there, and sometimes that's going to be enough, I think, to help the people around us. So if we want to make the world a little bit of a better place, more positive social interactions and being mindful about those kind of interactions around us, I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just to conclude our episode today, if our audience wants to find out some more about you and more about your work, where should they go?
So if you go to bridgeport.edu, you would be able to look up my University of Bridgeport faculty profile. I do have a LinkedIn page. I do have Google Scholar. All of those would be options to be able to look a little more at my own research and my own research interests.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, David, for joining us on the show. I'm sure that our audience has learnt a lot from you, as I have today. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see you in the next episode.
Thank you so much again.
You have been listening to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, pr.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Joanna. Thanks for tuning in.